I've really been enjoying this series, The King of Hearts, spoken by our very own Mark Pomeroy. I encourage you, if you haven't seen the other ones, to head over to our podcast and check them out.
Well, hey everybody, great to have you with us today for the fourth week of this series that we're getting a lot of very positive feedback from, called King of Hearts, where we're taking a pretty deep dive into the life and leadership of David, who ultimately went on to become the second king of Israel. And God himself described David as a man after, or a person after God's own heart. And we're like, well, we could learn from him with actually the aspirational goal of, wow, what if God described that of us, that we are people, and I'm a person and you're a person after God's own heart. So it is week 4, and if you missed any of the first 3 weeks, because we're walking through some of the highlights and lowlights of David's leadership in chronological order, it makes sense that you'd go back and watch or listen to any of the first 3 weeks that you missed, and therefore you can track along with David's life and leadership. Now, if I was in charge of marketing this series, I might be tempted to leave today's title off, or at least kind of bury it a little. I mean, here's the titles, the headline attention grabbers of this series. Like week 1, we talked about the heart God favors. Well, that sounds like something that we'd want to get into, want to learn from, want to develop. Week 2, the worshipful heart. Last week, the courageous heart. I mean, hello. Next week, we're going to be teaching about the loyal heart. And then the week after, we're going to be teaching about the blessed heart. I mean, these are all pretty juicy and exciting headlines. Well, I think it's, we'd include today's message title, but we'd probably just bury it in the fine print with the warning. We'll also be teaching about the humble heart and recommending maybe you might want to skip that week, which is today. And I'm going to come back to why some people might have that response when they hear about the humble heart. But I wonder if you've ever prayed for God to open a door. And then I wonder if you've ever prayed for God to open your heart. Because in my experience, both personally and observationally, sometimes God doesn't actually open a door because he knows we're not ready to walk through it. We're not ready for what's on the other side. He needs to do some more open heart surgery. Now, I shared a funny tweet that I came across. I shared this a few months ago. Someone tweeted out this: went to text my friend, I'm on my way, and accidentally wrote, I'm in my way. I think I just had a therapy breakthrough. And here's the thing, sometimes we're the barrier to break through. That we say, God, open the door, and God says, no, I want to first open your heart and do some more open heart surgery. One of the biggest barriers, one of the biggest things God wants to work on is this thing called pride. You know, we can be too often too proud to admit our own mistakes, too proud to learn from our own mistakes, too proud to learn from others, too focused on ourselves and not looking out for others, or too focused on ourselves and not looking up to God. You know, pride gets in the way. Pride can be the lid for us to go to new levels in our life and leadership. Well, now for the good news. If that's true of you, and it likely is true of many of us to varying extents, there is an antidote. The antidote to pride is humility. And even better news, humility is available to everybody. And as you and I grow in humility, we'll be a better friend, a better parent, a better leader, a better colleague, and a better team member. And I think going back to this idea of maybe not, putting this on the headlines, the humble heart, is because too many people have a misunderstanding of what humility actually is. So let me put on the table, first of all, what humility isn't. And if you've thought that humility is these things, then I understand why it might not be so appealing. But let me put these on the table for the sake of saying this is not what humility isn't a pushover. That if you choose to grow in humility, that means you need to let people treat you like a doormat. That means you need to let yourself and allow yourself just to be somebody else's verbal or emotional punching bag. That's not humility. Humility isn't a lack of confidence. You know, some people think humility is just downplaying your strengths because you don't want to come across as being too cocky and arrogant. Well, again, that's not humility. And then this kind of close cousin of that idea is intentional underperformance that you don't want in your workplace, in a meeting, in your team at your church, for anyone to perceive that you think you're better than anybody else, so you lower your performance. And I got to tell you, that's not what humility is, and that doesn't honor God. I'm going to come back to that. So let's shift gears and double click on what humility is. And I'll just put up two big ideas. Number one, humility, and this would be my definition of humility, is strength under control. And the second thing that humility is acknowledging your power source, acknowledging as a son and daughter of God that power comes through you, but not from you, that ultimately God is the source, and you actually allow him to work through you. And that means you can perform optimally in each and every setting, all the while giving glory to God for providing you with the power to do that. And I wonder if you've ever mentally associated the words strength and power when you've thought about the word humility. All right, let's jump into the immediate aftermath of David's victory over the giant Goliath. I just taught about that battle last week, the courageous heart. Go back and watch and listen to that. But this is what happened immediately in the aftermath. When the victorious Israelite army, which technically wasn't the army, it was David, but he fought on behalf of the army, so they all got to claim the victory. When the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistine, women from all the towns of Israel come out to meet King Saul. They sung and danced for joy with tambourines and cymbals. This was their song. Saul has killed thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul's like, hearing this song, wait, what? Well, then it's recorded in Samuel. Yeah, this made Saul very angry. No kidding. What's this, he said. They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands. Well, next they'll be making him their king. And Saul had no idea that God had already anointed David as king. He's just kind of like, man, this guy's popularity is rising to where he's seemingly either about to overtake me or has already overtaken me, and it's just a matter of time before they'll want him over me. So from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Well, we already know from 2 weeks ago that Saul's internal world had started to unravel, that he'd started to become anxious, he started to become paranoid. Now he's adding this very real threat in terms of popularity that David was bringing over him. And this got to the extent, this escalated in Saul's internal world to the point where he actually made the decision that he was going to kill David. He was going to eliminate the threat. Well, David got wind of this. David came to learn that Saul was out to kill him, and so he fled the region. And he spent considerable time from that point on roaming in forests, hiding out and living in caves. Pretty miserable existence. And at one point, King Saul, actually his intel fed back to him that they'd actually discovered at this particular point where David and his kind of band of followers were hiding out. So Saul got together 3,000 of his best soldiers, and they headed for that region to hunt David down. Well, look, while they were en route and getting near to where they had been informed that David and his men were hiding out, Saul needed to go to the toilet. Even kings need to go to the toilet. And so King Saul spotted a nearby cave. That's where he was going to get a little bit of privacy. And he went into the cave, just to the front kind of section, out of sight of his convoy. And he squatted down to do his business. Well, it just so happened that was the very same cave at that moment in time that David and his men were hiding out. And they were in the back of the cave, having understood that Saul's convoy was coming near. And so here we have David and his men who'd been on the run from Saul for months, potentially years, all of a sudden faced with the prospect of the very person that was hunting David down now being in the very same cave, oblivious to their presence, and in his most vulnerable position that you can imagine. Well, David did exactly as you'd expect. This is what's recorded. So David crept forward and cut off a piece of the hem of Saul's robe. And you're reading this and you're like, this is a good start, David. He's just taken a bit of the robe, and this is going to be one of those Hollywood slow burn type killings. I mean, he's not just going to go straight, he's going to kind of tease this out. Maybe a bit of torture involved. I don't know. Well, stay tuned. Now, before I drop us into what happens next, a few weeks ago, the amazing creators of the Bible app actually added a feature that allows you and me to set Elevate Church as your church in the Bible app. And all you need to do is grab your device, your smartphone, and open the camera and scan this QR code. It'll take you to the Bible app, and it'll allow you to set Elevate Church as your church. And initially, the way we're using that is every single week, on the Monday following our online experience and our live experience in Perth, we're loading in a featured Bible plan that actually follows on from the subject that we've been teaching. And that's going to allow us, and has been allowing us, all of us, to take a deeper dive during the week and actually go on the same journey together, learning more. So encourage you to do that. I know a bunch of you have already done that. Set Elevate as your church. You can do that. Now, the next cool thing is you can scan this flow code, and it's going to take you straight to the section of the Bible app that I'm about to drop us into. So why don't you go ahead and do that with your camera. Let me just further set the scene. David now has the element of surprise on his side. He's got the cover of darkness on his side. He's got the fact that Saul is completely oblivious to him and his men. And by the way, for what it's worth, Saul currently has no pants on. This is what's recorded in Samuel. Having just cut off a piece of the robe of the king, then David's conscience began bothering him because he cut Saul's robe. And he said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this to my lord the king. I shouldn't attack the Lord's anointed one, for the Lord himself has chosen him." See, everything about this scene pointed to the only logical thing, even reasonable thing for David to do was to kill, to assassinate King Saul, to actually end his own misery, to allow him and his men to come out of hiding. And actually, by the way, he'd already been anointed as the king, so this would have been the obvious ticket to ride for him to be appointed as the king. But instead, David chose to humble himself, to not do something because God hadn't actually called him to do it. God hadn't green-lit it, and so David backed off and didn't take matters into his own hands. And here's the reality. Sometimes courage is standing up and speaking up. Sometimes courage is standing up and taking action. And sometimes courage is keeping quiet, saying nothing, doing nothing, exhibiting strength under control. Still not convinced that humility is a great thing? Well, there's one time, and it's actually the only time, that Jesus verbally revealed what's in his heart. And he told his followers this: let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart. That the contents of Jesus' heart includes humility. Now, growing in humility requires God to do some internal upgrades in us, to perform some open heart surgery. And there's actually another side of the same coin, that as we're developing our internal world, we can, and I would recommend also, upgrading our approach to demonstrating that we are in fact humble, that we actually have humility as one of our guiding motives and principles. Because I've occasionally heard people say to me, quoting what David said, what God said when he chose David to be the next king. I've heard people say to me, well, people look at the outside, but God looks at the heart. Which is actually what they've said after they've done something dumb, and they've just said, well, people have misunderstood me. And it's like, yeah, they've misunderstood you, because your actions, your words, your approach do not reflect somebody who's humble. And so, yeah, you could, well, God looks at the heart, people look at the outside, but the reality is people do look at the outside. And so you might be shooting yourself in the foot for your terrible interpersonal skills, hiding behind well, God looks at the heart. Listen, let me tell you this, but actually I'm going to tell you something you already know. Nobody wants to work for a boss who has terrible interpersonal skills. Nobody wants to be raised by a parent who has terrible interpersonal skills. Nobody wants to be a friend of somebody who has terrible interpersonal skills. Nobody wants to work alongside or serve alongside somebody who has terrible interpersonal skills. And if, while God's working on the internals, your externals, your approach is lagging behind, you may actually be shooting yourself in the foot when it comes to growing in influence. So what I recommend is try to create maximum overlap with your intentions, your motive, your heart, your humility, and your actions, your words, the way you interact with people. Create maximum overlap to minimize the possibility of being misunderstood. Now, in the time we've got left, here's some of my practical tips, Marco's practical tips on how you can become more humbler. Now, I'm going to give you 7. These are all skills. And the great thing about skills is, in this case, they're not reserved for a select few. I mean, some of these might come more naturally to some people than others, but they can all be acquired. And regardless of how natural they are, I would strongly recommend that you consistently and intentionally develop these skills so that your approach will match your inner world, your heart, your humility. Here we go. All right, rapid fire. Number one, consistently serve others. Might sound obvious, but look, are we doing it? You know, my wife, Louisa, a couple of months ago, one of her colleagues, like my wife works in a high school setting, one of her colleagues was getting chewed out and dunked on by a parent. You know how it is these days? If your kid was underperforming 30 years ago, you dunk on the kid. Now, if they're underperforming, you dunk on the teacher. Not cool, people. Anyway, this colleague was being dunked on, and her superior was in the mix, was a part of it, and did not step in, did not defend the teacher, did not say to the parent, you don't get to speak to my staff like that. And so Louisa, who wasn't in the mix, found out about this, that a colleague of hers had been mistreated by a parent and mistreated by her leader, and had gone home in tears, just, not cool. Well, Louisa, again, who isn't the boss of this person, just a colleague, on the way home that evening, bought a bottle of wine and a card and packaged it up beautifully, wrote a very encouraging, heartfelt message to her colleague. The next morning left for work early so that she could get into the colleague's office and put this bottle of wine and the card there as a surprise to her colleague when the colleague arrived for work. And needless to say, when the colleague arrived, she cried more tears, but of course in this case, tears of joy. And Louisa does this all the time. I just picked that one story out of the air. There's plenty more. She does this sort of thing all the time. And here's what I can tell you. When Louisa is in a meeting, when she's interacting with colleagues, when she's maybe having to have a coaching conversation with somebody, her motives never get called into question because she's built up the track record of humility and serving other people. All right, here's number two. Tip number two, don't be a know-it-all. Fact number one, you don't know it all. Fact number two, everyone in your sphere knows you don't know it all. And fact number three, nobody likes a know-it-all. So stop it. Learn to ask questions. Be humble. Learn from others. Don't do all the talking. Don't pretend. Don't be a bully in meetings. Don't be a know-it-all. All right, tip number three, don't care who gets the credit. See, if you're in a team situation, a workplace situation, and you're jostling with other people to try and get the credit, the risk is that it becomes a best person competition instead of a best idea competition. And at Elevate, one of our guiding principles in any meeting and ideation that we do, the best idea wins. No matter who it comes from, the best idea wins. The one that's going to best serve our mission and the people that we're reaching and building, the best idea wins. Now, the only exception to this idea of don't care who gets the credit is if it's not you that came up with the best idea, then by all means, take the opportunity to publicly brag on and give credit to the person who did come up with the best idea. Okay, tip number 4, be approachable, not defensive. Now again, this doesn't mean be a doormat, be somebody's punching bag, just allow people to do anything and say anything they want to you. It doesn't mean you have to pretend to agree with everything and agree with everyone. But having humility means that, okay, I'm open to listening to what you have to say. At the end of having listened to what you have to say, I might not agree. Listening and agreeing aren't the same thing. You know, occasionally I have someone who's unloaded their perspective to me, and I've said, no, I don't agree with that, so I'm not going to do it. And they say, well, you didn't listen to me. And I'm like, no, I listened, but I don't agree. And if you want, I can even tell you why. And again, you might not agree with my disagreement, but I don't have to get defensive at the front of that interchange. Okay, number 5, here we go. Be quick to acknowledge you were wrong. The minute, the second you realize you were wrong, acknowledge it. If you've had an interaction with somebody and you realize you were wrong sometime later, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years, the second you realize you're wrong, contact them and say, I am so sorry. I've just realized, despite my maybe adamant position then, or I was wrong, and I apologize unreservedly. Now, sometimes it actually can build trust if you give them a reason for why you took the position you did previously. But an explanation isn't an excuse. Like, here's why I did it, and I'm sorry. I was wrong. Full stop. Okay, last 2. Number 6, speak life to others. You know that famous saying, if an encouraging thought forms in your mind, but nobody gets to hear it, did it really form? See, we live in an increasingly transactional culture, and quite likely you've been on the receiving end of this. We're often in our workspace, sometimes in our families, sometimes in our friendship circles. The only time you hear from people is when they want something. And that's not all bad, but if that's the only time people hear from you, then we're missing out on a massive, massive opportunity to build other people up, to demonstrate that we exist to serve and encourage and build other people up. You know, I can't strongly enough encourage you to be somebody who consistently beats a path to someone else's door, that you cross a room to encourage somebody, to tell them what you value about them, or what you value about what they just did, or what you value about what they bring to your family or your church or your team or your workplace. I occasionally, same would be for you, as a leader, and this is in life and leadership, occasionally face situations where I might need to have a coaching conversation or a clarifying conversation. Now, you can read some leadership material, some management material that talks about the approach to this kind of coaching conversation, clarifying conversation, as a turd sandwich. I mean, they don't use the word turd, they use the 4-letter adult word starting with S, ending with T, but let's just call it a turd sandwich for the sake of keeping this PG. The approach is that when you go to have a coaching conversation or a clarifying conversation, lead with something that's good about the person, something you value about them, something you like about them. Then drop a turd on them. Oh, and then finish it off with something else you value and you like about them. And the idea is that that'll be far more palatable to them than if you just go in with the turd. Well, let me ask you something. Have you ever been on the receiving end of a turd sandwich? And was it delicious? Did you enjoy eating it just because it was sandwiched with 2 compliments? I doubt it. Here's a better approach. The heavy lifting for achieving effective outcomes in coaching and clarifying conversations, the heavy lifting is actually done upstream. It's done every single time you seek out somebody to encourage. every time you sent a text message that wasn't asking them for something, was instead encouraging them with something. I like what you did there. I'm really impressed with that. I really value you, and here's why. Build up a track record of that. It builds trust. It builds relationship. It demonstrates your motive. It demonstrates your humility. It shows them, whoever the them is, that you exist in large part to serve them, to make their life better, their world better. And then when you come in with a coaching conversation or a clarifying conversation, they don't receive it, they're less likely to receive it as a turd and get defensive and actually potentially just kind of disregard everything that you want to achieve, and more likely to be receptive and receive it as a gift, that you're putting that on the table so they can be better, together you can be better and be more effective in the very thing that you're doing. And here's my final tip for becoming more humbler. Number 7, become a bragger about others. I mean, if you ever had somebody toxic or somebody in your sphere talk to you in a toxic manner about somebody else that wasn't in the room, we call that gossip, okay? Have you ever, once that person's finished their diatribe and they've left the room, have you ever find yourself wondering, gosh, I wonder what that person says about me when I'm not in the room? Well, there's no mystery. Let me tell you, they say that sort of negative, critical stuff about you when you're not in the room. Because the reality is, and one of life's great lessons that it's critical to understand, is that people that gossip to you will also gossip about you. Because the issue isn't the issue, their habit is the issue. Well, it cuts both ways. See, gossip gets a bad rap because it's talked about in the negative sense. But what about this? What about if you and I commit to becoming people who talk about people who aren't in the room in a very positive way, that you brag about people who aren't in the room. You build them up, don't tear them down. You talk to other people about what you like about them, what you value about them, what they did that was incredibly impressive. How about we become those sorts of people? Which says so much about us, by the way, but it also does so much to building people up. Encouragement is often defined as oxygen to the soul. And you can breathe oxygen into people's soul by speaking life to them, and you can build oxygen in and breathe oxygen into your family, into your workplace, into your team, into your church, by also speaking life about other people, even when they're not in the room. Okay, we got through it. The humble heart, people. Next week, I'm going to teach on one of my life top values, loyalty, and how to develop a loyal heart. So we'd love to see you back then. We'd love you to bring somebody. We'd love you to share our online experience with people in your sphere. I encourage them to join us live or on demand. And let's continue to reach people and build people.